Good. Well, good afternoon, y'all. I want to welcome y'all to our Bible study today. Hope you're doing well, and glad you're here on this Masters Week Pastor's Bible Study. That's what it is, and but we're glad to be here today. And if you're joining us online, welcome. Glad you're part of our time together today as well. So, here's what I want to do today. We're going to walk through the Sermon on the Mount, okay? And we're going to do the entire sermon today, all right? Because I've put a plan together. We're actually going to be studying Matthew all the way through the end of this year. And so we've got to, at the end of, when Bible study ends, I think in November, I think that's right. So we got a little work cut out for us to get all this done. So we've got to get this one done. So when you think about what Jesus is really doing in this sermon, you remember in Matthew 11, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you, and my burden is easy." He's challenging us to view the world the way he views it, and to practice life the way he practices it. And I would contend if we did that, that would be flourishing. If we truly embraced the perspective Jesus has and we choose to live the way he's called us to live, that would be flourishing. And so consequently, these teachings from Jesus are encouraging us in a life of flourishing. And so I brought with me one of the commentaries that I use in my study in Matthew, and it's written by Jonathan Pennington, and the title of the book is The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. And he does a theological analysis, particularly of this sermon, but he connects it to a much broader conversation about human flourishing, which I think is appropriate to do. And, you know, Matthew, when you look at the way the Gospels are laid out for us, you have these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you think about it, Matthew and John are both eyewitnesses. They're apostles. Mark and Luke are associated with apostles. Luke is associated with Paul primarily. Mark is associated with Simon Peter. And so to me, it seems like those two Gospels are placed in the middle, and these two hefty eyewitness accounts are placed on either side, if that makes sense. And both Matthew and John are these massive volumes. Luke is as well. But Matthew builds his gospel around these 5 sermons. But I think we would all agree that if we were to ask just a typical Sunday school member or church member, can you name the 5 sermons in the Gospel of Matthew? They probably would start with, well, there's the Sermon on the Mount. You know, so, and I think that's okay, I guess. I think all of his sermons are important, but this was the most famous one. And when you look at the scholarly material throughout history, there has been more written about the Sermon on the Mount than any of the other teachings of Jesus, which I guess it just stands to reason this is the most famous sermon. So, with that said, I've already given you all an outline of it, and what I'd like to do today is digest that outline for you and just walk you through the Sermon on the Mount. So, before I offered any kind of overview of the Sermon on the Mount, I was gone to Virginia, and Kurt Grice taught through the Beatitudes. So we've done that. So if you look at what I would consider the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount is the first 16 verses. So we've done the Beatitudes, and what's interesting is in this commentary by Jonathan Pennington, he provides, he's a New Testament scholar at Southern Seminary, but he's a Matthean expert. He's one of the leading experts on the Gospel of Matthew alive today. Incredible scholar. So he gives his translation of the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of the commentary. And it's interesting how he translates the Beatitudes. And so let me just read you a couple of them. Verse 3, flourishing are the poor in spirit because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Flourishing are the mourners because they will be comforted. Flourishing are the humble. He uses the word flourishing every single time for the Beatitudes. And I actually like that. I think that he is challenging us to rethink what Jesus is teaching us in the Beatitudes. It's describing the people of God. This is what flourishing looks like. I think the heart of the sermon, if I can say it that way, is found in the next two sections of the sermon. So the core of this sermon, I would contend, is found in verses 13 through 16 of Matthew 5. This is the calling of the people of God. So let's look at it. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people put a lamp and light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. One of the most famous statements from Jesus that's actually made its way into most Westerners' vocabulary when we refer to somebody who is the salt of the earth. You don't have to be a Christian to use that phrase. A lot of people use that phrase, and it comes from this particular text. So here's what Jesus is saying from my perspective. This is the call to be witnesses. We're members of the new covenant. And if you look back at verse 11 and verse 12, in Greek, the shift is found in the movement from singular to plural. So in verse 11, there is a direct word to, or the pronoun is plural, not singular. Verse 11, blessed are you, plural. Verse 13, plural, you are. Verse 14, plural, you are. So I think 11 and 12 serve as a bridge from the Beatitudes, even though some people would consider verse 11 its own standalone Beatitude. I usually number it with verse 10. And it serves as a bridge to that next section where Jesus is describing us. Now, Dr. Pennington says that we are outward-focused agents of the kingdom of heaven. That seems to be what Jesus is saying to us. Now, it's interesting that he chooses this analogy, salt and light, and he puts them side by side, and he uses the same phrase so that they're parallel to each other. You are and you are. And so why does he use the imagery of salt and light? Well, if you think about it, there are a lot of things we could say about salt and light. Both of them were very much understood in the ancient world. You all know that salt was something that was actually used as a payment for people. We get our word salary from that word. And so it was used actually in payment, if you will. But here's what's interesting in the Hebrew mindset when you think about salt and light. Let me read to you back in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13 says this, season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings, and add salt to all your offerings. And so when Jesus uses the imagery of salt, many scholars believe it is a reference to the covenant and the covenantal relationship that God has with his people. And Jesus is on a mountain, if you will, on a mount really, but there's imagery there that called to mind what Moses did. And so I think if I can say it this way, the flavor of the covenant is found in this teaching. Salt, of course, we know seasons, it preserves, it cures, but salt was used to bring a certain permanence to things because they believe it would preserve things. Light is for sure associated with the new covenant. Jesus is going to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah. He's going to be a light unto the Gentiles. And so I would say that principally what's underneath this challenge from Jesus is he is drawing upon the imagery of the old covenant, and he's establishing the new covenant, and salt and light are both affiliated with the covenant with God. So it's a core calling. This is how we glorify God. Verse 16, we engage life in this way. People see us live in this way, and they give honor and glory to God. So this is the calling of this sermon, for us to be salt and light. We've talked a little bit about this before. It requires a lot of nuance for us because our temptation is to be too salty and to be too laser-like, or to not be salty at all and not even shed any light on anything. So there's a ditch on both sides of the road. We've got to figure out how to provide just enough salt in this world and just enough light in this world so that people can be drawn to the gospel. And that is a huge challenge, and I would tell y'all it's going to take your whole life to figure it out, because this is something that we're all going to struggle with. Part of being a disciple is learning how to live like this, learning how to be salt and light. I think it's the very heart of this sermon. It's what Jesus is calling his people to do, who he's calling them to be. I think then he moves into the body of the sermon, starting in Matthew 5, verse 17. And this next section to me is the next most pivotal section because of how he's going to craft the rest of this sermon. So let's look at this as we walk into the body of the sermon, once he now has introduced everything. Verse 17, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Because here's the question on the table in that first century world. What is the relationship that Jesus has with the Mosaic covenant? This is going to be a point of controversy for the Pharisees. Who is this man, and how does he relate to what we already know that's been given to us through Moses? Okay? So Jesus states it. He said, I didn't come to abolish all that. And he said, I've come to fulfill them. Now, the body of the sermon starts here. I would contend it ends in chapter 7, verse 12. If you look at chapter 7 and verse 12, the last phrase says, this sums up the law and the prophets. So he says, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets. And then you come to the end of the body of the sermon itself, and he says, this sums up the law and the prophets. So what's in between to me is the body of the sermon. Does that make sense? Here's what Jesus is trying to teach us. This section here sets everything in place for us, though, starting in verse 17. He says, verse 18, I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Now that's a reference to his own ministry. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So this is what scholars typically refer to as greater righteousness. Now, this would have been really challenging for a common person in Jesus' day to hear this. You have got to be more righteous than them. When in their world, they were the most righteous people alive. And so Jesus is saying, but you in my kingdom are going to have to be more righteous than they are. And what he's going to unpack for us is the shallowness of their righteousness. And he's going to demonstrate that their righteousness is rooted in their external behavior, not the inner transformation that he's going to bring about. And so he would contend that the Pharisees and those who were living that way were not whole. They were lacking. But you, as a follower of Jesus, once you begin the journey of being transformed on the inside, and that begins to be reflected in your life on the outside, that's what a disciple is. That's where wholeness appears. And when the inside of you that's being transformed is connected to the outside of you and how you live, and you're doing it for the right reason, the right motivation, that righteousness is greater than external acts and rituals. Does that make sense? So your righteousness really can be greater than the righteousness of the Pharisees, because so many of them have lost touch with the inner transformation that's supposed to occur. So this is a profound introduction to the body of this sermon. Greater righteousness is connected to wholeness, internal transformation, the external manifestation of it. Matthew's quick to point out that Jesus said, I'm going to fulfill all of this. Well, that should not surprise us, because fulfill language is all over Matthew. We've already read in the first 4 pages where Jesus is fulfilling prophecy. This was done to fulfill the prophecy that says this. So Matthew's gospel is about the fulfillment of prophecy. And so Jesus is now connecting his teachings to salvation history. In other words, he didn't just show up. Remember, he told John the Baptist, you've got to baptize me to fulfill all righteousness. In other words, everything that I'm going to accomplish in my ministry, my death, burial, and resurrection, this hope for the future, there's a plan in place, and you are the prophet who was supposed to pave the way, make ready for the Messiah. I'm now the Messiah. I'm stepping into this moment. Jesus is, in his own acts, is stepping into salvation history. Now in his teaching, he's stepping into salvation history. So this is the plan of God all along. And so Jesus is helping us to understand, and certainly helping his hearers understand, this isn't some radical change that has no connection to what's gone before it. This is a connection to everything that's gone before it, and it's going to fulfill it all. You know, when John the Baptist in the Gospel of John first saw Jesus, he said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Well, what's the Lamb of God? Well, that's an Old Testament understanding of the sacrificial system, and all of it points to Jesus. So Jesus is basically saying all of my teaching fits into this salvation history story. Now, so with that said, how do you live as salt and light? Well, Jesus, you could argue, I guess, and some people do, that Jesus was a philosopher at some level. And what I mean by that is he did teach a certain worldview, a certain way to think. But it's so much deeper than that, so much richer than anything anybody had ever heard before. But what he doesn't do is just utter platitudes. That's not how he taught. He took real life examples that people could understand, and he would show you how to be salt and light. So in the rest of this sermon, the rest of the body of the sermon, he's going to give 6 applications. Let me just run through them real quickly, okay? For example, look at verse 21. He starts with an understanding of murder. And he's taking something that these people would have understood, and they understand the law, and he now is going to help them to understand how deeper he's going to take them in the application of God's intent all along. Some people have put it like this, that Christ's commands contain all of the Old Testament commands, but the Old Testament commands don't contain all of Christ's commands. So if you fulfill what Christ is commanding, you're connected to the fulfillment of everything God intended in the first place. So Jesus says, let me give you some examples. These are things that will help you understand the application of what I'm asking you to do and who I'm calling you to be. So you might say, well, I've never murdered anybody. And Jesus is going to say, great, but how often have you been angry? How often have you called someone with a derogatory name? How often has that just spilled out of you because of what's inside of you? What you need to know is that's just as bad. And you may look at it and say, wait a minute, that's not as bad as murder. Well, what Jesus is saying is there's something on the inside of us that's got to change. That's his point. He's not trying to say that just being mad is the same as murder. He's just saying you don't get off the hook because you haven't done something on the outside, but you've got something that lives inside of you on the inside that's eating you up. Does that make sense? He said, I'm calling you to a different kind of life. I'm calling you to a complete transformation of life. Murder, look at verse 27. Adultery. He's taken these messages that they would have understood full well from the 10 Commandments. You know it's been said, you shall not commit adultery. But I'm telling you, if you choose to objectify women, he's talking to men here, objectify people of the opposite sex, so that the only reason they exist is to satisfy your whims and your desires, he says, then you are guilty. And so he challenges them. He uses some hyperbolic language where if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. Jesus is prone sometimes to hyperbole. And then one of the big controversies in Jesus' day in terms of theological debate had to do with divorce. Verse 31, marriage and divorce. These people lived with that. As I told y'all, I think already, there were 2 schools of thought in the Jewish world in the first century. There was one group who was incredibly conservative and just basically didn't allow divorce for any reason. There was another group that said a man could divorce a woman if she cooked supper and he didn't like it. You could just cast her out. And obviously those were somewhat facetious kinds of arguments, but the point is, One group of rabbis said a man can divorce a woman for any reason. Another group said you can't do it for any reason. So there was this huge controversy about what does this even mean? And then the problem was in the first century, if a woman was divorced by her husband, and I'm going to say it that way because that's the only way it could happen. Because in the first century, a woman could not divorce her husband. Only a husband could divorce his wife. Well, in the first century, there was no hope for a divorced woman, a single woman, to live her life and somehow find her way. There were only a handful of things that single women could do in the ancient world and earn money. So just let y'all think about that for a second. There's only a handful of things that you could do. So more often than not, they just got remarried. And so once that happened, well, then there were many who said, well, she's committing adultery. She's gotten remarried. What Jesus is saying to these men is, well, if you do that to her and you cause her to have to go that path, you're the one that's actually guilty. You're the one that's causing her to commit adultery. That's the argument that he's making. Now, he's going to talk about this much fuller later in the Gospel of Matthew. This is just a very succinct statement. The point is, he's challenging these people to think beyond their justifications for why they do anything, and without any kind of intrinsic motivation that's pure and holy. And so they're treating the things of God lightly. And he's challenging them to recognize the sanctity of what God has given us, the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage. And then look at verse 33. In the ancient world, it was very common to swear by things, swear by pagan gods, swear by what you think God was going to do for you. And Jesus says you're not going to do that. You don't take the name of the Lord in vain. You don't swear on his name. You know, it's kind of when we'll read this coming week, in Holy Week, we'll read about Simon Peter denying that he knows Jesus, and the text will say then he begins to swear. It doesn't mean that he just started using a plethora of cuss words. He started doing what pagans did. He started swearing by the dependence upon what God was going to accomplish in him. I swear by the God of heaven, that kind of language. Jesus said, you don't talk like pagans do. You don't take God's name and use his name that way. His name is holy. In other words, if you're not going to hold the things of God holy, if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to be my disciples. Does that make sense, y'all? He's challenging them to think about some of the cavalier ways they treat things. He's not giving an exhaustive list here. He's only touching on 6 topics, trying to help them understand the depth that he's calling them to. Verse 38, revenge. He said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that sounds good. It's just hard to do because most of us take 2 eyes for an eye and 5 teeth for a tooth. It's hard to, you know what I mean? It's hard to just act in the way that you've received. You just struggle with it. Human beings just do. We can't help ourselves. Well, so Jesus says, look, break the cycle of revenge. Just break it. And choose to act differently. And if someone does take advantage of you, then you decide how you're going to respond to that. And here's one of the ways that you can truly show them you're not like them. You don't respond in kind. As a matter of fact, you respond with kindness. And look at how that de-escalates situations. Every one of us have been in situations where we've experienced cycles of revenge. They never work. There's no end to a cycle of revenge. You just can't end it. The only way to end it is to end it. And so Jesus is challenging them. And then verse 43, here's a huge statement from Jesus. Love. Love is the most powerful force in the world, really, if you think about it. Love your enemies. Recognize the fact that God has created everybody. They're in his image. And you've got to demonstrate that you're going to relate to people differently than the world is going to relate to people. So in other words, Jesus is setting forth some challenging examples. But these are applications of salt and light. Like I said, it's not an exhaustive list. That's not the point. Then he moves to a little more personal challenges, I would say. Chapter 6, your own personal piety. These are things that not everybody's going to know about you. So look at chapter 6, verse 1. He says, be careful not to be like the Pharisees, not to just practice your righteousness so that other people will see it and be impressed by it. He says, if that's what you do, then you have your reward. And the only reward you have is what other people think of you. Jesus says, but that's not the life I'm calling you to. I'm calling you to a deeper, richer life. So starting in verse 2, what happens when you see somebody who's in need? Well, you decide what to do in those situations. That's what Jesus is saying. He says, here's what I would tell you. Be generous. Be sincere. Let God lead you whenever you find somebody who is in a situation where they are in trouble. And don't brag about it. That's so hard to do, isn't it? When you do something for somebody else. I've told y'all this story before, but when Cindy and I were in seminary, we had a friend of ours who was in seminary with us, and he was from Colombia, and he was one of the finest men I've ever met. His name was Irmo Howard. He's dead now. But Irmo, back in those days, whenever you did, when you registered for seminary, when we were in seminary, you registered in line, not online. And so, and at the end of the line, you paid. So you would go through the line, and you get to the end of the line, and you paid for your whole semester. That's how it worked. Irmo would give us so many testimonies. Every semester when Irmo Howard got in that line, he had no idea how to pay for it at the end of the line. And by the time he got to the end of the line, his semester was paid for every single time. One time we did it. I was with him that day, and I knew we had done it. He had no idea. So we're just in line talking. And he did not say one word about it. He just walked right through the line, just like everything was, that he was ready to pay. We got to the end. He was in front of me. I was behind him. He got up there, and the lady said, Irmo, your semester's already been paid for. And he just went, thank you, Lord. He looked at me, and he said, it took everything in me to not go, you're welcome. But now the fact that I've told y'all, I just lost it. So, but my point is, I never told him, but I can't tell how hard it was for me not to, because I want him to know. Well, Jesus said, don't let your right hand know what your left. Be genuine, be sincere. God's always watching. I promise you, he's always watching. Which Jesus is calling for something deeper than just how you behave. How you behave connects to the depth of who you are, and they work together. I believe that. I believe that these virtues, when you live this way, it affects your inner person, but it grows out of your inner person to begin with. That's why this transformation is so powerful on the inside. Then Jesus says, now, pray, your own personal prayer time. Nobody knows what that's really like but you. So Jesus says, here's my advice to you. Don't pray for show. Don't make a big deal about your spirituality. And then he gives us a way to pray, the model prayer that's listed there beginning in verse 9. And it's a pattern of prayer is what I would say. It's an acknowledgement of God. It's a recognition of the things that God is all about. But it also gives room for us to ask God for the things that we know we need, both spiritually and physically. And then verse 16, another word about piety. When you're fasting, don't make a big deal out of it. In other words, don't put on your spirituality and wear it in such a way that you want everybody to see it. This is between you and God. And then he kind of sums it up in verses 19, 20, and 21, where he says, and treat your possessions that way. Be careful or they will overrun you. They will overtake you. And then he transitions and turns them toward the world, toward the end of this body of this sermon. 19, 20, and 21 serve to me as a bridge, starting verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. In other words, what we see is so powerful, and how we see it is so powerful. How it affects us. Jesus says you need to be careful how you choose to look at things and allow them to influence you. It's a powerful image. It lights up everything inside of you. And he says, you can't serve light and darkness. And then one of my favorite passages in this text is found at the end of chapter 6, starting in verse 25. Where Jesus says, now that you've heard all this from me, don't worry. Live the way I've called you to live, and don't get so tied down into this world. Once again, that's really hard to do, isn't it? But it's what he challenges us to do. And he puts at the very heart of it, verse 33, seek my kingdom first. Seek the kingdom of God first. Make sure that's at the very forefront of everything you do. Trust God with the rest. Give God a chance to show you who he is. I promise you he's paying attention. When I look at my world right now, I love this time of year. The spring of the year I love the spring. Growing up in Alabama, where we grew up, this time of year, azaleas and dogwoods and, everything just kind of, all of a sudden, it's like you get up one morning and then there it all is, And it's been there all along. And all of a sudden you can see it, and it's just there's just something about it. It's the new life that you see. And now I'm not saying we don't have some of that in Texas. We do, okay? It just feels different there, but nevertheless, I like being here, so don't freak out. But I'm just saying, isn't that a beautiful thing? I could just remember as a kid, we never worried about our dogwood trees blooming in the yard. They just they just did. That's just the way God did it. And so I love that, how God takes care of his own. He just does. We just have to trust him. That doesn't mean that we don't engage in life. Of course we do. But when we get to the point where we think it's all in our own hands, that's what Jesus is challenging you to do, to see. It's not all in your own hands. God is your God, and he's there for you. Trust him. Give him an opportunity to work in your life. And then chapter 7, be discerning. You've got to live in a relationship with other people. Some people misinterpret chapter 7, verse 1, don't judge or you'll be judged. What he means by that is you're going to have to be discerning, but be careful that you don't go overboard or you'll be judged the very same way. You reap what you sow in this world. We all have to make judgments. We have to be discerning, but he just says it's going to be measured back to you. And then I love verse 3. It's one of the most famous passages as well, where Jesus says you see that speck in your brother's eye and you can't see the log in your own eye. Well, we all can relate to that just a little bit. We're all quick to judge. And if there was ever a statement from Jesus that should be applied in a culture, now would be the time to apply that in our culture. Because we're the most spec-intensive culture that I can ever remember right now, and the most log-blind culture that I can remember. It's like nobody can see who they are, but they can see the fault in everybody else. It's amazing how that just seems to be playing out in front of me. Jesus cautions us against that. And then, verse 7, keep seeking. Keep walking with the Lord. Keep asking. Keep giving God a chance. Trust him. Let him know you're in a relationship with him. It's okay to share your needs with him. He's your father. As a matter of fact, when you start in chapter 6 and go through the first 21 verses, Father is used 10 times. Father is used 17 times in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus is communicating something to us. And then he comes to the end. And the conclusion is where Jesus just paints a picture. It's a call to action. And basically it narrows down to this. There are just two ways to live. There are two kind of prophets. There are two kind of builders. He's basically saying, all right, now that I've taught this to you, now you've got to decide what you're going to do with it. Are you going to walk this path? Are you going to listen to this teaching? Are you going to trust other teachings and other voices? Are you going to listen to my voice? Are you going to build your whole life on this and let this be the foundation of your life or not? If you choose the wrong path, if you choose the wrong prophet, if you choose the wrong foundation, it will all be done at your own peril, is his challenge. And so this sermon, and there's an introduction, there's a really deep, strong body to the sermon. There's a powerful call at the end to take this and apply it to your life. And then you get to the end in verse 28 of chapter 7. And these people say, we've heard a lot of teachers. We've just never heard anybody like this. This isn't a rehashing of the Mosaic covenant. This isn't a re-explanation of the law. These folks were familiar with the law. Jesus for sure was. They said, we've just never heard a rabbi talk like this because he speaks with so much authority, they said. And we're just amazed by it. Well, that's going to follow Jesus his entire ministry. He's going to teach with authority. And the reason for that is because he's the Messiah, the Son of God, the King. And that's one of the reasons he has basically split history. And he just stands, you just have to do something with him. You just have to deal with Jesus. He's the person that has stepped into history and changed everything. His teaching was very different than anything else anybody had ever heard. And then his life and his ministry and his death and his burial and resurrection will change everything throughout eternity. So this sermon's a powerful sermon, y'all. It's got so much in it. We could spend this entire year just trying to unpack all of it. I would encourage you to read it, meditate on it, listen for the call to have greater righteousness, listen to the call to trust him, Listen to the call to develop that inner character and have that inner transformation so that it will ultimately find its way in your life. And ask Him to connect those things in your life, because our behavior should grow out of our relationship with Him. That's when it's most authentic. That's when we're most whole. That's when we're truly righteous. And to me, that's how we best are able to be salt and light in our world. All right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that are online, thank you. We'll see you next time.